Hi, everybody. Good morning. How are you doing? Happy June. Yes, I'm Reverend Mary Shelton. I am the community spiritual leader and the senior minister here at Golden Gate Center for Spiritual Living. I'm really happy to welcome you. Those of you who are here for this first Sunday in June. This is my birth month, so I like it a lot. And we'll sing happy birthday to all the June people, later on in the service. But if you're here with us today for the first time, I just want you to know that whoever you are, wherever you may be on your pathway of faith, wherever that is, wherever it's taken you, we're delighted that you're here. You're welcome here. We look forward to seeing you often in the future. So we are into the month of June, and this is the month, God bless you, of vulnerability. I notice there's a lot of enthusiasm for vulnerability out there, right? Yes, the power of vulnerability. I want to share something with you about being vulnerable this morning. This is by Dave Barry. When you're 47 years old, you sometimes hear a small voice inside you that says, just because you've reached middle age, that doesn't mean you shouldn't take on new challenges. This is the voice of Satan. I know this because on a mountain in Idaho, I listened to this voice, and as a result, my body feels as if it had been used as a trampoline by the Budweiser Clydesdales. This is because I went snowboarding. For those of you who, for whatever reason, a will to live perhaps, do not participate in downhill winter sports, I should explain that snowboarding is an activity that is very popular with people who do not feel that regular skiing is lethal enough. These are young, fearless people who can hurtle down a mountainside at 50 miles an hour, knock down mature trees with their faces, and then spring to their feet and say, cool. People like my son. He wanted to try snowboarding, and I decided to learn with him. In skiing, you wear two skis so you can maintain your balance by moving your feet. In snowboarding, all you get is one board, which is shaped like a giant tongue depressor. Both of your feet are strapped to it, so if you start to fall, you crash to the ground like a tree while skiers swoop past and deliberately spray snow on you. Skiers hate snowboarders. It's a generational thing. Skiers are, and here I'm generalizing, middle-aged Republicans wearing designer spacesuits. Snowboarders are defiant young rebels wearing drab clothing that is baggy enough to cover the snowboarder plus a major appliance. Skiers like to glide down the slopes in graceful arcs. Snowboarders attack the mountain, blasting through snowdrifts and leaping off cliffs. Skiers view snowboarders as a menace. Snowboarders view skiers as Elmer Fudd. My first snowboard lesson went fine until I had to stand up on my board, which turns out to be a violation of at least 5 important laws of physics. I'd struggle to my feet, and then the physics police would drop a huge chunk of gravity on me. Wham! I'd hit the snow. My son had no trouble at all. In minutes, he was cruising happily down the mountain. You could actually see his clothes getting baggier. I, on the other hand, spent most of my time lying on my back, groaning, while spacesuited Republicans swooped past and sprayed snow on me. I now realize that the small hills you see on ski slopes are formed around the bodies of 47-year-olds who tried to learn snowboarding. Now that's a little bit about vulnerability and being willing to be vulnerable, because something happens with us and we actually become afraid to be vulnerable. Now, it's said that when we're born, we're only afraid of falling and loud noises. I think that's what the two things are. And then as we get a little older, we begin to be afraid of other things. And it seems to me that on some level, that caveman person that we still are thinks that anything that we imagine might be a threat is actually a danger to our very lives. So, if you're afraid you're not going to get enough dessert, there are times when you could panic about that, or get really upset about it. Does anybody relate to this at all, what I'm saying? So when we fear something, we often fear some kind of an attack. So we don't know who these two people are to each other. All we know is that they're in a parking garage. He's wearing a hoodie, and she looks apprehensive. And so we can interpret seeing a picture like this as saying, she is afraid of this guy. She is afraid of injury or loss of some sort. Maybe he's going to take her purse. Maybe he's going to knock her down, steal her car. He, on the other hand, may be somebody who is afraid to even say hello to her, or if he knows her, to ask her out, because maybe he's afraid of rejection or humiliation. And for some reason, every one of those things seems so huge to us when we're experiencing it that it can be like a big stoplight that just stops us in our tracks. Like we're not willing to go forward into what we think could be rejection, humiliation, some kind of loss, or perhaps some kind of injury. I read that a risk equals the probability of hazard multiplied by the degree of vulnerability. The degree of vulnerability. So we have, I think, as adults, certain myths that we believe about vulnerability. We may say that we don't, and maybe on some level we believe that we don't, and yet it's so prevalent to sort of have these things be under the radar culturally for us that we may feel something that we don't even recognize as one of these when we see vulnerability or when we feel it. The first one is, and by the way, this is the new screen, but not the new projector, which will be a rear screen projector. So everything is a little darker and a little harder to read this morning. I apologize for that because I created it for the new system, but I'll walk you through it, all right? So the first one is that that vulnerability is weakness. That if you show vulnerability, you're going to get run over. You're going to get smashed to the ground. So the first one is weakness. That vulnerability is weakness. Now, I got to show you why I have this fierce guy up here. I don't know how well you can see him. If you read my emailed invitation to this week, one of the things I said was that when I was a little kid, I saw Beauty and the Beast on television. It was in black and white. And I had dreams about that beast for I don't know how long after that. The beast lived in my closet. That's one thing I would imagine in bed at night. Or the beast was under my bed and I didn't dare put my foot out because he would grab me. Now, in looking back at that, what I realize is that as far as I can remember, I never thought about him actually hurting me or actually stealing me. It was more that I was afraid of the first moment of the initial encounter. I was afraid of being grabbed or being frightened. But I don't think I ever worried about what would happen after that. It was just a sense that something bad would happen. Okay? You with me so far on this? Okay? So the first thing is vulnerability is weakness. When I was a little girl also, there were big boys that lived around where we lived. And one of the things that they liked to do was scare me because I would run shrieking home. And so they would, in a line, they would come and they'd ride their bikes close to me like they're going to hit me. And I'd shriek and I'd run into the house and I'd be all upset. And my mother finally said to me, you know, the reason they do that is because you react. You behave, you're scared. They scare you. If they couldn't scare you, they wouldn't do it anymore. So I held my courage together one afternoon when I was standing in the backyard in front of some of the bushes back there looking at the flowers, and they started to come with their bikes toward me. And I was trembling, but I made myself stand there and not run away and not scream and not cry and not do anything. And you know what? It worked. It never happened again. Now that was a huge thing for me. And so by the time I was 10 years old, I was really pretty good at hiding my emotions and not letting people see how I really felt about things. Because I had decided that vulnerability communicated weakness. All right? The second thing we often think is that if we show vulnerability, it undermines our credibility. Many years ago in Santa Rosa, we did the on-course personal growth course that was developed by Michael and Paulette's son that was about science of mind. And they had an assistant who was teaching part of the curriculum that weekend in Santa Rosa. And every time he told a story about anything, he was the hero of it. He was the one who figured out the answer. He was the one who overcame whatever it was without fear or difficulty. He was, And 2 days into the thing, I already couldn't stand him. And the reason was, and that I'm exaggerating, that's not really true at all, but I did say something finally about, if you never show any sign of vulnerability, nobody can relate to you. It's like you're holding yourself up here saying, for all you people who deal with these problems, which I never have to deal with, and it doesn't make what you're saying accessible. Does that make sense? And so I had learned by that time that not to let people in on your growth process does not allow them to enter into their growth process as easily, and also makes you kind of unlikable in a way, because you're holding yourself as not human. At least this was my opinion. Okay. The third thing is, and I'm sorry you can't see this one better because it lands right in his teeth, is the myth that being vulnerable makes you a patsy. That if you're vulnerable, you're also gullible. That if you're vulnerable, somebody's going to take advantage of you. And that would be a terrible thing. When we lived in Huntington Beach, I had somebody come to the door in our condo who told me that they needed money for I don't know what, but their car was broken. Their girlfriend was going to stay there while they went with this money to do whatever it was. And if I could give them X amount of money, they would leave their Rolex with me, and their girlfriend was going to stay, and all this stuff. And I had an abundant amount of money at that time, and I said, yes, it's not a problem, you bring it back to me when you get back from, going and doing what you need to do. So I gave him this money, and then he left, and probably 15 or 20 minutes after that, I thought, I think I just gave $50 away. And rather than beating myself up for being gullible, what I thought to myself at that moment was, because I had the luxury in that moment of not feeling like I was at loss for not having that money, because I had money. So instead, I got to look at my tendency to feel ashamed of myself for being gullible. But what I thought instead was, well, I was just the vehicle. I don't know what's really going to happen with that. Maybe for some reason he doesn't even know he needs it more than I do. And so I'll just let it go and let it do whatever it is it does. And maybe because he has my money, something will transform him. Who knows, right? So I sent it out that way instead. It didn't make me feel like a patsy. But so one side of it is the way we interpret it. But the other side of that is that just because you're vulnerable doesn't mean you can't be discerning. Just because you're feeling vulnerable doesn't mean you can't say no. It just means you feel vulnerable while you do it. And I think that that's a place that's really valuable, is allowing ourselves to feel vulnerable and take a wise action in the moment anyway, to say no or to respond to a criticism without getting defensive, to be in the place of vulnerability without making it feel like we have to fall apart because of that. The next one is that vulnerability is disempowering. So what I was just saying is, when we feel like nobody wants to feel disempowered, then we feel endangered, we feel weak. But if we could feel empowered and vulnerable, wouldn't that be an interesting thing? Also, we sometimes think that only losers show their hand. Only losers put everything out for the other person, assuming that the other person will do that. Instead, you assume that they're going to hold something back. I have a recipe for a pie that was given to me by my former mother-in-law years ago. It was a secret recipe. And what she told me was that when her friends asked her for this amazing recipe, she would give it to them, but she'd always leave something out. So they could never make it quite as well as she had. never tasted quite as good. And so she gave it to me, telling me she was giving me all of the ingredients to this, and I should be mindful about passing it on, which I never was. But the idea that, you got to hold something back, otherwise you're a loser. By definition, you're a loser already. And the last one is that being vulnerable always reveals too much. I have a friend in the Pacific Northwest who has the same birthday that I do, and we used to joke about how much he wore his heart on his sleeve. He would say, I would tell my life story to somebody standing at the bus stop with me that I've never seen before. I cry at Kmart openings, So he was definitely not one who was afraid to reveal too much. That too much information thing? He was the king of that. But to think that made him more vulnerable, I don't know that I would say that I would think that. He certainly made some interesting friends that way. So I want to now go to the other side of this, from the 6 myths to 6 truths about vulnerability, or about being vulnerable. And you're not going to be able to see this very well, unfortunately. This is the last duel between Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars, in the very first Star Wars movie. And if you never saw it, or you don't remember it, or you're not a fanatic, and what is wrong with you? At the last duel, one of the things that Obi-Wan says to Darth Vader is, "If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you could possibly imagine." And then shortly after that, because there's an open bay to where all the ships are out there, Luke and Leia and Han and Chewie and a bunch of people run past, and Luke sees Obi-Wan, or Ben as he knows him, dueling Darth Vader, and he comes toward them, and Obi-Wan sees him. And in that moment, he makes a decision. And it's just about at this moment, he takes his lightsaber from its defensive position, and he moves it up like this, and then he turns it off. And Darth Vader strikes him down. What happens in that moment is not something that comes out of weakness. That choice to be vulnerable requires strength. To be that kind of vulnerable, that is completely vulnerable, completely available, and completely grounded, confident, and unafraid. See, I think we assume that vulnerability means fear, or that because we feel vulnerable, we're necessarily endangered. Now, he was, but we're not always facing that, right? Also, being vulnerable engenders a kind of trust, because when we let people in on our processes, they feel like we're trustworthy to hold theirs, because they recognize that you know what it's like. This is why, if you're in a 12-step program, a sponsor needs to be somebody who's ahead of you in the program, because they know where you've been, and they know what your games are likely to be, so you can't play any of those. And they know what it feels like, what kind of encouragement you need, what kind of support you need. It would not be nearly as effective if your sponsor was somebody who had never experienced an addiction and had no idea what you were experiencing. That would not be very effective. So that vulnerability of stepping into recovery engenders trust in other people. Also, as I said before, it doesn't mean you're a patsy. You can still be discerning about what's going on. You can be vulnerable. I remember somebody I was dating at one point, when my son was little, was teasing him. And Luke was uncertain of what was happening exactly, because he knew what he thought was true or real, but he also knew he was being told something else. And so he looked at me like, now a lot of times when parents gang up on kids in that way, they just agree, and they just say oh yeah, they stick with each other on that. And the kid goes away doubting their own perception. And that's supposed to be funny. So, but I don't find that funny. So when he was teasing him and Luke was saying, really? And he was going, oh yeah, and he wouldn't cop to it. When Luke looked at me for validation about, what's going on here, I just said, honey, you have good instincts. Trust them. So in that moment, I thought of myself as a hero, like, yay, Mom, I didn't jump into that. But what I wanted to be able to do was to let him know that even though he was not in power in that moment, he was the weak one in that moment, that his instincts were good. You can be vulnerable and be discerning at the same time. And also, rather than it being disempowering, sometimes the vulnerability itself can be empowering, which is a weird thing to say. And I can't say that I do this with great skill or even all the time. But instead of reacting defensively when somebody says something that feels too close to home or a little critical or a little something, that sometimes I have found, like standing at the bushes when the boys went by with their bikes, that I can sometimes stay centered enough in that upset to ask more or to consider that that could be true. Or maybe the reason I feel vulnerable is because it's so close to home, and maybe I can step toward that instead of blocking it or stepping away from it. Maybe I can say, you could be right, tell me more about what you're seeing. So the few times that I have done that, what I found is that afterward, I don't feel drained and embarrassed. I feel like I balanced it or I weathered it. And so that's something I want to do more of. That's something I think is valuable to do. I actually felt like it was empowering to do that. And even quaking in your boots, So I think that a winner can show vulnerability, and maybe the winner is the one who can show vulnerability. I don't know about you, but sometimes politically when I listen to people talk and they won't take responsibility for something that's turned out to be a mistake because they think it would be politically suicide or inconvenient to admit having made a mistake, that really bugs me. I don't care what side they're on or what they're talking about or what their deal was. If they made a mistake, I want them to, stand up and own it. And then let's move on. Now, maybe I'm completely wrong about that. Maybe the actually smartest strategy they could do is to stand in there, well, this was the best thing that could be done at the time, or whatever it is, I don't know, but it does bug me. And I do think that winners can show vulnerability, and I admire people more who can own that stuff. That's just me, but I do. And lastly, I think we can be selective as people who are revealing something in our vulnerability. Because we choose to be accessible does not mean we have to reveal everything. Unlike my friend, in that moment or in that conversation, that we can still choose how much we reveal or how much access we give. We can open all the way, or we can open part of the way, depending on the moment and the circumstances and our own intuition, our own judgment, our own discernment. Is this making sense? Yes. So I'm looking at the myths, which I think are really lived out a lot culturally for us, and I'm looking at what I think the truth is behind that, really. And maybe it takes a willingness to risk in order to step into that area of being more vulnerable. But here's the thing I know about you, or this is what I think about you. This is my projection. My projection on people who are part of Centers for Spiritual Living, people who are religious scientists, is that you are a risk taker, or you wouldn't be here. You would be someplace safer, someplace where people are saying more traditional things that don't rock the boat, that don't create a ripple. Now, there are more and more people in the world who are coming forward into a place of balance between these things, of balance between invulnerability and vulnerability, or between a balancing of confidence with vulnerability, a balancing of groundedness and choice with vulnerability. Finding that place, that is what I would call a sweet spot. The sweet spot is the spot of balance. You look at these stones and think, They must be glued on, right? They've got to be, it couldn't possibly balance like that, could they? And yet there is one guy who makes his art this way by balancing stones that are way too big or way too oddly shaped to balance in the ways that he places them. And yet they find that sweet spot where they stay right where they're supposed to. This is our balance in our willingness to be honest, our present moment awareness of our own inner feelings of vulnerability, and our courage and availability. We're balancing those things. I'm going to share a little story with you. This is years ago. A farmer owned land along the Atlantic seacoast, and he constantly advertised for hired hands because most people were reluctant to work in those farms along the Atlantic coast. They dreaded the storms that raged across the ocean and wreaked havoc on the buildings and the crops and the people. And so as the farmer interviewed applicants for the job, he received a steady stream of refusals. And finally, a short, thin man, well past middle age, approached the farmer. And the farmer said, "Are you a good farmhand?" And the man said, "Well, I can sleep when the wind blows." Although he was puzzled by this answer, the farmer, who was desperate for help, hired him. And the little man worked very well around the farm, busy from dawn till dusk, and the farmer was very satisfied with his work. And then one night, the wind started to howl from offshore. And the farmer woke up immediately, jumped out of bed. He grabbed a lantern. He ran down and pounded on the door to the hired hand's sleeping quarters. And he grabbed the door and he shook the little man and he said, "Get up, a storm is coming. We have to tie things down before they blow away." And the little man rolled over in bed and said firmly to him, "No, sir, I can sleep when the wind blows." And the farmer was enraged. And he was tempted to fire the guy on the spot, but instead he hurried outside to go around by himself and prepare for the storm. But to his amazement, he discovered that all the haystacks had been covered with tarpaulins. The cows were all in the barn, the chickens were in the coops, and their doors were barred. The shutters were tightly secured. Everything was tied down. Nothing could blow away. And the farmer finally understood that what his hired hand had meant, and so he returned to bed and to sleep also while the wind blew. So when you are prepared spiritually, mentally, physically, whatever comes, we have nothing to fear. The hired hand in the story was able to sleep because he'd already secured the farm against the storm. And the way that we secure ourselves against the storm that sometimes seems to be going on around us, the way that we secure ourselves is by our connection with God. I don't know that I could do it, but I know there are people who have faced muggers that they didn't know if muggers were going to kill them or not, and been like the monk who is attacked by the samurai, where they're available to meet the person, and because of that meeting, they were not harmed. I don't know that I could do that. I don't know that I could do that. But I think that that's an amazingly revealing, healing, transforming thing to have happened. Brené Brown, who is kind of the queen of vulnerability right now, in her book, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead. She says this: vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they're never weakness. And then she says, vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. And finally, this is from our founder, Ernest Holmes' Ideas for Living. We might say the universe is so constituted as to maximize play. The best games are not those in which, oh no, this is George Leonard. I'll get to Ernest in a minute. George Leonard says, the best games are not those in which all goes smoothly and steadily toward a certain conclusion, but those in which the outcome is in doubt. Similarly, the geometry of life is designed to keep us at the point of maximum tension between certainty and uncertainty, order and chaos. Every important call is a close one. We survive and evolve by the skin of our teeth. We wouldn't really want it any other way. And so Ernest Holmes says this, the kingdom of heaven is a thing to be devoutly experienced. It is the pearl of great price for which a man will sell all that he has in order to possess it. And yet, it is the only thing that he had before he asked for it. It is the only thing that he possesses that he cannot lose. It is the only thing that is eternal, for it is God incarnated in every soul. Consequently, it is not an outward pomp or an external proclamation, but it is a state of interior awareness, coming softly and gently to the soul who recognizes its presence. If it were an eternal thing and not immediately accessible in our own, rented lips, what can you do? If it were an external thing and not immediately accessible in our own consciousness, we should never be able to find it. It is an idea that conveys us to this place. Heaven is lost for want of an idea. And the idea that is lacking is the recognition that the work of the eternal is complete. Our evolution now consists in our awakening to that which was and is to be. The vulnerable place is the doorway. That's the doorway. Not when the door is locked and we think we're safe inside. The vulnerable place where all the possibilities exist is just beyond that threshold. So I would like to encourage you to do something this morning that moves you beyond the threshold of comfort zone. It doesn't have to be a life-threatening risk. Say hello to somebody if you would normally go home without doing that. A little risk, just a little one, is good. Start there. Or if you're up to it, take a big risk. Namaste.